Hello folks. In this video we'll look at how rural Kansans helped to win World War I. As you may remember, the war broke out in August of 1914 after the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife while traveling in Bosnia in the Balkans. The Archduke was heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His death led to the mobilization of armies across Europe. When Austria threatened war against Serbia, Russia supported the Serbs. Backing its ally Austria, Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany mobilized. They declared war on Russia and France. Great Britain chose to support the Franco-Russian alliance. In a matter of weeks, a regional dispute ignited a major European war, ending a long period of relative peace. The Great War would prove a costly war. An estimated 15 to 22 million died in combat, and new technologies altered battlefields. Soldiers fighting in the trenches encountered poisonous gases and new weapons of war. These included machine guns, tanks, and airplanes. Submarines transformed ocean warfare, endangering trade and travel. Because the European countries depended on imports of foodstuffs and raw materials, Britain sought to blockade the coast of Europe with its surface fleet. Germany turned to submarine warfare to isolate the British Isles. Meanwhile, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson attempted to assert neutral rights. Under traditional international law, a neutral country should be free to trade with warring countries, and its citizens safe to travel on vessels in war zones. But traditional neutral rights conflicted with the realities of submarine warfare. Several significant violations of international law occurred. One was the German sinking of the British liner Lusitania in May 1915, carrying American citizens. Nevertheless, President Wilson campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the theme, "He kept us out of war." His message appealed to women in 12 states, including Kansas, where they voted for the first time in presidential elections. Wilson won a very close election, but found he was unable to keep the country out of war. Early in 1917, Germany opted for unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans expected to defeat Britain before the U.S. could mobilize and enter the conflict. In early April, then, President Wilson responded to the challenge, asking Congress for a declaration of war. It's worth remembering that at the outbreak of the war, Kansas was a rural state. Over 70% of its 1.7 million population lived in small towns or on farms. There were few paved roads and little electricity outside towns and cities. About 8% of the state's population had been born abroad, far less than in many eastern states. In Massachusetts and New York, for example, over 30% were foreign-born. Nationally, there were nearly 3 million people born in Germany and Austria, among the nation's 92.4 million residents. It's estimated that 66,000 German immigrants lived in Kansas, about 4% of the population. Many more had family and cultural ties to Germany and the warring powers. In some counties, German was still spoken in public schools and churches. Not surprisingly, Kansans generally opposed the war. Governor Arthur Capper, himself a Quaker, abhorred war He espoused peaceful solutions through his newspaper, Capper's Weekly. It was widely read by farmers. Capper was also a leader of the Kansas Peace and Equity League. It promoted the notion that love was better than guns to prevent war. For Capper and many Kansans, the greatest foe was not Germany, but liquor. To improve the nation's defenses, they wanted to rid the country of saloons. And in early 1917, Governor Capper enthusiastically signed the Bone Dry Law enacted by the legislature. It prohibited personal use and sale of liquor. After America entered the war, a popular slogan in this state became, "Booze and the Kaiser must go." In April 1917, when Congress approved the declaration of war, Governor Capper urged Kansans to uphold the president and give loyal support to the government in Washington. Not everyone agreed. Two Kansas congressmen, one a Democrat, John Connally, the other a Republican, Edward Little, had voted against the war resolution. They offered different explanations. Connally cited the biblical injunction, "Thou shalt not kill." Little, who had fought in the Philippines, said that he found it easier to fight himself than to send others to war. Elsewhere on the Great Plains and in the Midwest, there was considerable opposition to President Wilson's war. One official who dared condemn the prevailing peace at any price movement in Kansas was George Morehouse. He came from Diamond Springs in Morris County. Morehouse was a former state senator and in 1918 was president of the Kansas Historical Society. He accused some Kansans of dallying with the dastardly Hun. He claimed that German gold and crafty German agents were fueling the anti-war movement. Today, Morehouse is sometimes remembered for another act. He wrote the bill making the sunflower the Kansas state flower. As it turned out, Kansans generally supported the war effort with enthusiasm. The state furnished about 75,000 men for the Army, Navy, and Marines. 816 would die in combat. A larger number, 1,453, died from disease. Many of these from the Spanish flu at Camp Funston near Manhattan, where thousands of draftees were sent for preliminary training. Before military draft registration began on June 5, 1917, many young Kansans volunteered for military service. They were motivated by patriotism and adventure. In several counties, including Chase County, volunteer enthusiasm exceeded draft quotas, and as a result, none were drafted in the first round in those counties. Of the 729 men in Chase County who registered for the draft, 128 were Mexican aliens who worked on the Santa Fe Railroad. Another 327 were farmers. The local congressman, Dudley Doolittle of Strong City, argued for deferring farmers and beef producers from military service. He considered their work essential for winning the war. As it turned out, many farmers were excused from military service. Across Kansas, 40 to 75% of rural registrants were deferred, but in the cities, the opposite occurred. In Wichita, only 5%, and in Kansas City, only 2% were deferred. Many Kansas soldiers and sailors distinguished themselves in World War I combat. The 35th Division, composed of the Kansas National Guard and units from Missouri, fought in the Bloody Meuse-Argonne campaign of September 1918. It suffered heavy casualties. The 35th Division lost 1,067 men killed and 6,216 wounded. One of the soldiers was a future U.S. President, Harry S. Truman. On the Kansas home front, patriotism surged. Young men who failed to register for the draft and report for military duty were branded unpatriotic slackers. County sheriffs pursued, arrested, and jailed these slackers. Some of the slackers sought to avoid military service by declaring themselves conscientious objectors. Among them were a number of Mennonites imprisoned at Fort Riley and treated harshly when they refused to perform non-combat duties. The Wilson administration, determined to overcome fervent anti-war sentiment, sought to silence dissent and to rally public opinion behind the military mobilization. The Espionage Act of June 1917 empowered the Postmaster General to censor from the mails items that, in his judgment, constituted willful obstruction to the war effort. Postmaster General Albert Burleson, a Texan, vigorously enforced the act, refusing to deliver publications he deemed seditious, such as foreign language newspapers. He considered banning the Kansas City Star from the mails for carrying columns critical of the Wilson administration. In May 1918, Congress passed the Sedition Act, prohibiting speech disloyal to the military and the government. It barred speech in support of countries at war with the United States, and it forbade speech in support of labor strikes. Under these wartime restrictions, members of the left-wing industrial workers of the world, the IWW, were arrested in Butler County. They had threatened to disrupt oil and wheat production in Kansas and Oklahoma. These so-called wobblies were convicted in federal court. The prosecutors presented evidence that the wobblies planned a program of sabotage to disrupt the war effort. Before World War I, a popular activity in the autumn for many Kansans of German ancestry was to celebrate German Day. These events included speeches about the German heritage, music in the German language, and of course, a mug of German-style beer. For example, in November 1913, 2,000 German Americans celebrated in Leavenworth with German patriotic songs. That would change during World War I as super patriots sought to eliminate all German influences and promote Americanism. Across Kansas, pictures of Kaiser Wilhelm were shredded. In Marion County, a telephone company instructed operators to cut off anyone speaking in German. In Ellsworth County, Vigilantes closed down a German-language school and gave its organizers 12 hours to leave the community. As a result of such pressures, schools and churches abandoned the German language and chose to back the U.S. war effort. As one example, voters in Toledo Township, Chase County, overwhelmingly decided to ditch the German language instruction, describing it as the enemy tongue. But Kansans did not abandon everything German. At Christmas time, they continued to sing the German song Silent Night, which had become a well-established holiday carol. Efforts to curtail German influences focused on areas with large numbers of German-speaking Mennonite farmers. They were in Harvey, Marion, McPherson, and Reno counties. In September 1917, the Kansas Teachers Association accused 20 school districts in Marion County of teaching in German. Newspaper headline writers had a field day, branding Marion a German province, calling the county a disloyal Kansas spot, and claiming that Kaiser has hold on public schools in Marion County. The critics were right in part that a number of schools in Marion County did teach English for 5 months and in German for 2 months. Kansas required 7 months of instruction in English, but there was no evidence of support for Kaiser Wilhelm. As German Americans, the Mennonites sometimes thought themselves enemies in a foreign country, and as pacifists, traitors to the American cause. Early in the war, a German-language newspaper in Hillsborough, Marion County, encouraged contributions to the German Red Cross. Its editor, Abraham Schellenberg, sought to present the German view of the war to his readers. He opposed arms sales to Britain. These, Schellenberg considered a violation of America's neutrality. However, by 1918, as pressure to conform increased, Schellenberg began running articles favoring the purchase of government liberty bonds. By that time, the Mennonite community sought to demonstrate good citizenship with contributions to the American Red Cross and purchase of government bonds. To finance the war, the Wilson administration sold bonds and stamps. There were war funding drives locally. Counties sought to surpass their assigned quotas. In some counties, there was initial resistance from Mennonites and Quakers who considered themselves pacifists. As a result, local vigilantes threatened violence to slackers, apparently not supporting the war effort. There were tar and feather parties, night riders organized to rid counties of German spies, German sympathizers, and dirty slackers. Some Mennonites were given the choice of buying bonds or having their whiskers shaved by a mob. Most Kansans supported the war. They sought to help those drafted for military service. The Kansas Council on Defense coordinated local responses. Their final report provides fascinating detail. Like many counties, Chase County in the Flint Hills, which was one of the smaller counties with a population of about 7,500, exceeded its bond quotas. It raised over $1 million for Liberty bonds, more than 20% in excess of the quotas. Home demonstration agents showed women how to conserve and preserve food and to eliminate food waste. School children planted war gardens. Nearly every resident who could obtain a few feet of ground planted gardens. Boys at the Chase County High School worked for farmers, helping to bring in crops. Girls knitted sweaters, socks, and helmets for soldiers. According to the state superintendent of schools, Chase County High School ranked 3rd among state high schools in total amount of war contributions and purchases. Behind much larger schools in Topeka and Fort Scott, it was first on a per capita basis. The American Red Cross functioned as an extension of the military during World War I. It provided a variety of services offered in later years by the Veterans Administration and the military. From July 1917 to February 1919, the Red Cross established 24 hospitals with nearly 15,000 beds to serve wounded soldiers. It built 12 convalescent facilities for the crippled and disabled. In addition to military relief, the Red Cross offered assistance to the families of soldiers and sailors. It organized programs of work for women and junior members. In Chase County, the Red Cross had over 2,000 members. Local women made gauze bandages and knitted socks and sweaters for the military. Not surprisingly, the Chase County Red Cross raised over $26,000 in 2 drives, 46% above its quotas. The county also raised over $16,000 for relief programs operated by the Salvation Army and the Knights of Columbus. Another volunteer group active in Europe was the YMCA. It catered to the soldiers' moral and physical welfare. It sought to promote a muscular Christianity through its facilities. The YMCA sought to steer young men away from the temptations of saloons, brothels, and gambling dens. It sought to direct these so-called doughboys toward recreational activities, educational improvement, and religious services. YMCA huts offered a home away from home while fighting vice with sports and entertainment. Yes, there were some criticisms of the YMCA's management and miserliness, but it did bring to Europe at least one outstanding talent. He was the legendary James Naismith, the inventor of basketball and director of athletics at the University of Kansas. He helped spread basketball to the troops in Europe. There were other important changes that impacted the home front during the Great War. We will mention several briefly in the time available. Enactment of the Bone Dry Law in 1917 brought prohibition to Kansas. It forced saloons to close and helped, the supporters said, to keep soldiers sober, but it proved a boon to bootleggers who transported liquor from Missouri. Another change involved greater work opportunities for women. They learned to make armaments and package food for the military. During the war, many Kansas women also marched and demonstrated with suffragettes in behalf of a national constitutional amendment securing the right to vote for women. We should also note that the federal government imposed daylight savings time as a war measure in 1918 and 1919. It was not popular with farmers. In Kansas and other states, farmers opposed the time change, saying they worked from daylight to dark without regard to clock settings. The Spanish flu epidemic in 1918-1919 tested the Kansas health system. It was already weakened by the large number of doctors and nurses who left for Europe to care for troops. Some counties were left with no doctors. In Topeka, 25% of the doctors and nurses reportedly went to Europe. But it was in agriculture that residents of Kansas made some of their most significant contributions. The belief that food will win the war motivated Kansas public officials and farmers. It was based on the realities of global war and world food production. Both members of the Anglo-French alliance and the Central Powers relied on imported food. In 1914, for example, Germany imported 30% of its food, and Great Britain about 2/3 of its calories. As a result, the warring powers sought to use blockades and submarine warfare to starve the civilian populations of their opponents and gain victory. A month before the U.S. entered the war, Governor Capper anticipated the need for greater food production and called a food conference in Topeka. The Kansas Council of Defense, set up in April 1917 at his direction, highlighted the need to conserve food on the home front and to produce more for the military and European relief. It encouraged victory gardens and promoted personal sacrifice. Mondays and Wednesdays were to be wheatless, Tuesdays were to be meatless, and Saturdays porkless. The Kansas Defense Council sought investors to buy seed for small farmers. It wanted to mobilize resources for farmers to produce 200 million bushels of wheat in 1918. The council's slogan was, "Win the war with wheat." The 1917 wheat crop had been a disappointment because of dry weather and wind. Kansas produced only 45.3 million bushels, less than half of pre-war levels. There were other obstacles to overcome. One was the loss of farm labor to the military. In 1918, the state prevailed upon high school students and civilians to help with harvests. Also, the Defense Council gave priority to mechanization. It promoted the use of tractors. The number of tractors on Kansas farms doubled during the war years. As it turned out, Kansas more than doubled its wheat production in 1918 to 102 million bushels, 11% of U.S. production. The next year, production peaked at 152 million bushels, 16% of U.S. production. Kansas averaged over 100 million bushels during the war, a level approached in only one pre-war year. Kansas farmers increased wheat production 43% during the war years, while the rest of the country increased wheat production only 24%. In short, it was Kansas wheat that helped win the war and in shaping the destiny of the world. As Governor Capper observed, Kansas farmers were at the center of the breadbasket of the world. With due regard for the sacrifices of those who served in the military, the State Board of Agriculture concluded that Kansas's greatest opportunity to serve was realized through the utmost utilization of her God-given advantages for food production. We might summarize our discussion this way. Agriculture, particularly the production of Kansas wheat, played a key role in winning the Great War and alleviating hunger in war-torn Europe. While rural Kansans provided many good soldiers, on the home front, residents also proved successful as soldiers of the soil. In light of this effort, it's worth remembering how enthusiastically Kansans celebrated the armistice on November 11, 1918. In many towns, there were parades and fireworks and bonfires to burn the Kaiser in effigy. As a footnote to Kansas history, we should remember that Kansas wheat production also proved a key to victory in the Second World War. For more information on this, please see my video, Soldiers of the Soil, How Rural Kansans Helped Win World War II. Thank you for listening.